Hey dudes, it's Llarold. Patch 11.1 has been out for 2 weeks. The Mythic Plus and Raid season are both 1 week old, and I want to talk about them. Mainly I want to focus on the state of Mythic Plus, so let's just go ahead and get right into it. And the first big question here is the War Within Mythic Plus Season 2 any good? Yes. This is kind of a shock to me, at least it would have been a shock to me a couple of months ago. A lot of people expected it to be the worst season of all time, including myself. I said that could happen, although to be fair to myself, I said it before testing it even started for the PTR and before Blizzard made several rounds of big nerfs. I just kind of looked at the group of dungeons that were available, looked at the lack of major systematic changes happening to Mythic Plus and said, this could be the worst of all time. But it's not. It's actually a pretty good season, and it got a lot better about halfway through the week. Basically on Friday, Blizzard dropped a huge nerf patch, and there were a lot of nerfs in the patch. The big one really is just simply that they reduced damage and health for monsters by 10%. So with that being said, I think we both agree that this is a really great Mythic Plus season for new and returning players especially. If you've never really done Mythic Plus or you've never been very serious about it, this is a great time to get on board. The quality of life improvements are good. The continued efforts toward bringing the difficulty level down a bit are also welcome. And the improved clarity on ground effects are just like really, really good. The game is in a much better shape than it was in Season 1 of the War Within, and the dungeons are surprisingly much better. And on that note, I kind of want to just look at a little dungeon ranking tier list that I've kind of thrown together here. I was going to make a whole big thing out of this, but I'll just kind of move through this more quickly since it is just the end of week 1, and, you know, this is kind of still our first impression. So this isn't necessarily a ranking of the 8 dungeons based on their difficulty or exactly, you know, it's kind of a combination of difficulty and just how much we've enjoyed them and so on. So we did run all 8 dungeons a lot. I think between our mains and alts, we probably ran over 40 dungeons this week, and we timed most of them on 10s. I think the only 2 that we didn't do on 10s were Priory and Floodgate, you know, whatever. But in any case, we got to like 2,500 something rating. We kind of have the same philosophy as we always do. The reward cap is around level 10, so that's about what we're gonna stop at, 10, 11, maybe even a 12. And then really not that interested in pushing beyond that. But for week 1, this is definitely the easiest that dungeons have been in terms of doing the full run of 10s. That they've been in quite a while. They were certainly harder than this in Season 1 of the War Within, and I would even say probably most of Dragonflight was harder than this. And so, you know, that's, I think, a good thing for making this kind of more inviting to newer players. Just getting your feet wet with a 2 or a 4 or whatever, it's really quite a lot less difficult than it used to be. So in terms of these 8 dungeons, I think everyone pretty much agrees that the Motherlode is like shockingly easy, for certainly given what we expected and what we were used to with BFA. It was a real nasty dungeon once upon a time, and now it's really not too bad. There isn't that much to interrupt in it. There are some crucial interrupts like some CCs that you really need to get early on in the dungeon, and some very dangerous casters in between the first and second boss, I suppose. But, you know, like, it's not the most brutal dungeon in terms of interrupts, and it's really just not that difficult of a dungeon. The damage tuning just isn't that high. The bosses are actually pretty easy as well. This is where I kind of zig, where other people are zagging, or maybe the other way around, whatever. Theater of Pain is, I think, also a great dungeon. The only real downside to it is that it's very long. It's a 5-boss dungeon, and it's 3 separate wings, and it's like a bit of an ordeal to kind of walk through all of the wings, but I really do think it's a pretty good dungeon. Very easy as well, like, again, just another one that even with groups where you're like, you know, feeling like the DPS was struggling, or people were just like dying to mechanics or disconnecting, or, you know, whatever, still managed to time it. Like, we didn't have any problems with that. Actually, we timed every single 10 that we completed this week, now that I think about it. We didn't have a single one where we were over time. We were at a couple that were very close. Cinderbrew was very close, but we never had any that we didn't time, which is pretty cool, actually, considering we were mostly doing like 6 a.m. pugs. Darkflame Cleft, I think a lot of people expected to be the worst dungeon of all time. I think I even said that in a previous video. This is going to be the worst dungeon of all time. I know I've said that to friends and guildies. Not the case. You know, you could make the case that it's the best dungeon of the season, that it's the #1. The only real reason that I don't have it up in that level, because I actually have come to really like all of the bosses and most of the pulls in this dungeon, is really like two things. One, there's a trash mob in the first kind of hallway that knocks other trash mobs around, and that's just very annoying. You could pull it out and then pull it back in. That is an approach. You can just have a DK and grip stuff back together, but it's just kind of an annoying trash pull. And then also the corridor crawlers in the kind of back quarter of the dungeon put this stacking dot on the tank, and the only way to deal with it is either to Divine Shield, which only one class can do, or Kite, and neither of those are like good as a way to deal with a tank mechanic. They just immediately stack up this dot. It's incredibly brutal, and really you could only just Kite. That's terrible. But then I think the biggest reason that I knocked it down from an S tier to an A tier, like I thought it was worth dropping an entire letter grade, is the cart in the kind of back end of the dungeon. Sometimes it'll bug out and it'll just leave. It just runs away from everybody. It doesn't like stop and let you do trash. It just starts going. And if you don't have major offensive or mobility cooldowns to catch up with it, you might just literally not be able to catch up with a cart. And that is something that we ran into in some of our runs, where we actually had to stop and pick up candles and fight monsters in the area with candlelight because the cart was just gone. So that was really, really irritating. Everyone was really mad. We had multiple wipes and still managed to time, but just very, very irritated by how badly the cart worked in what was otherwise a pretty good dungeon. Then the Rookery is another one that I think a lot of people are really going to like. And I do think it's a good dungeon. I just think the damage on the Rookery is very high. With that being said, I think it's probably the easiest to time, maybe the easiest to time in terms of the timer being forgiving. It really is just a matter of like whether you'll make it to the end of the dungeon or not, because the damage in this place is really high. But then there's probably the least number of monsters that you have to kill, like the least amount of enemy health that you have to go through of any of the 8 dungeons. So on that front, it's pretty easy, but then you're really compensating it. Like the healer's going to get a workout, but the DPS are going to have a pretty easy time. I think that would be my takeaway from the Rookery. So Mechagon Workshop, I was really irritated that they brought back Mechagon Workshop instead of Junkyard. That is a great dungeon, all-time great dungeon even. And Workshop really isn't, but then they reworked some of the bosses, really just the first one. Got a pretty substantial rework, and surprisingly, I think it's pretty good. I hate to say it, like I always hated that dungeon. I always thought it was like one of the worst Mythic Plus dungeons ever, and certainly that was one of the worst boss fights ever in Mythic Plus. But now I actually think it's pretty good. Yeah, I think it's just a pretty generically good dungeon. I think the only real issue I have with it, and the reason I'm kind of bumping it down, is I think the damage is kind of high in some of the spots. I really don't like the second fight. And I think the fourth fight, the King Mechagon, is the orbs on that fight are pretty oppressive. He either needs to move them around a little less frequently, or maybe just like if there were only 3 orbs, that might be a better approach to that fight. But then the other big issue I have with Mechagon Workshop is that every single one of these other dungeons pretty much has a W key route that you can do and get like right around 100% completion. And Workshop, if you just do a W key route, which is what I always try to do with pugs, especially when we're playing at like 4 in the morning, which is usually when we're doing it, I like to just hold W and run from the start to the end. No skips, play it safe. If you do that in Mechagon, you're going to get like 110%. There is really no way to not get like 108 to 110%, and that is disappointing. I really don't care for that. All right, the next 2 dungeons, Cinderbrew Meadery and Operation Floodgate, they're okay. Cinderbrew Meadery, I think the biggest issue with that is just simply the monsters. I mean, the monsters in the first room are incredibly dangerous, but just generically throughout the dungeon, there's just too many little monsters with too much health. There's just too much health on monsters throughout the entire dungeon. Like, we did a run, a 10, we timed it with like 2 seconds left or something. We had no wipes. We had pretty good damage throughout the run. I was pulling pretty aggressively throughout the run. It just took way too long to burn through the enemy health pools. And then the only other real negative I would say of that dungeon is I think the third boss, the B boss, is one of the worst, most boring tank fights that they've made in quite some time. the entirety of the tank mechanic is you pick up some ads, and then there's a dot on you that you run to the wall over and over again, and you can't even immune your way out of the dot. I believe if you divine, it'll still go on you. That's my recollection, at least. AMS also won't work, so really just an awful fight. I do like the final fight, though. Operation Floodgate is a new dungeon. I like the route that I use for it, kind of going off to the right side and starting up there. Overall, I think it's just an okay dungeon. It just feels very, very overtuned. And having done it before Friday and after Friday, the nerfs were definitely needed, but they weren't quite enough. I'm also not really a big fan of the swamp monster boss. I feel like I've seen so many people kill each other by trying to run out of the big frontal line that he does by running in opposite directions and you know, snapping together. And it's definitely funny to see people die, but it's also just a pretty annoying mechanic. I don't really care for it. And then the final dungeon, Priory of the Sacred Flame, is just very overtuned. It's just so much more deadly than every other dungeon. I think that this also really emphasizes something that Theater of Pain does to a much lesser extent, and that is lieutenants suck. Lieutenants are just terrible. They're basically bosses, and they probably should just be bosses. But then if they were to do that with Priory, this would be like a 9-boss dungeon. The lieutenants are very dangerous and slow and boring. Like, you look at a lot of these different lieutenants, they only have 2 mechanics. They knock the tank back and hit you for half your health in one swing or more, and then they stomp the whole group. It's boring, but it's also like a big, very deadly training dummy. So really not a big fan of that at all. There's just so much area denial and so much damage in this dungeon, and you know, if they hit this dungeon with another 10% damage reduction and health reduction nerf, because there's also massive amounts of health on all the mobs in there, and also tons of trash to pull, you feel like you've pulled basically an entire dungeon's worth of trash just before you've even gotten to the first boss when doing Priory. I think if they were to take, you know, again, another 10% nerf on this place, I still think it would be like middle of the road. I don't even think it would be particularly easy. So anyway, there you go. This is my opinion on the subject. You know, S tier for Motherlode and Top, Dark Flame, Cleft, and Rookery I put down a little bit for their various reasons, and then the rest are the rest. Now, I like Archon. They have a little bit of a different opinion on, not really opinion, right? This is all aggregated through data, so theirs is purely a dungeon ease tier list, and I think I would definitely agree with this in terms of like Motherlode being easier than everything else. Dark Flame and Rookery being a little easier than everything else. Top I found to be easier, maybe that's just my personal familiarity level with it. Kind of the same with Workshop, I actually found these to be easier than Rookery, but that's just me. But you know, it's like, it's data aggregation, so there are some flukes in there, right? There's like 90% of specs are in the S tier category. I don't think that's necessarily true. Alright, so with that being said, now I just want to talk about tank classes and just do like a quick fun ranking, and I'm specifically talking about fun. Not talking about goodness, although there's definitely an overlap there. And so this is where I'm at after the first week of the season. I think Paladin and Blood DK are both incredibly fun, S tier, like absolutely love playing both of them. Prot Warrior I would actually put a little bit further down. You know, it's good. It's definitely stronger than it was before the patch. It does tons of damage, which is fun. Maybe it deserves to be up there with them. But it is a little slower, and that's probably for the best for everybody's wrists who plays the class. But like, if we're being real, Prot Paladin's actions per minute is up from where it was before. It is higher than Prot Warrior was before. I am over 100 APM on Prot Pally in most situations now. So I don't know why Prot Pally managed to just completely escape having their class redesigned, and Prot Warrior didn't. You know, it is what it is. I wouldn't mind getting another like 50% more damage as a Paladin, but yeah, I don't know. Kind of a misalignment of ideals there between those two specs. I think Demon Hunter and Druid, Demon Hunter's clearly very, very good in Mythic Plus. It arguably is better than Paladin. It certainly is competitive. Druid is not, but for me, neither of them are really all that fun. I've just not really been that big of a fan of Demon Hunter since the mid-Dragonflight redesign that made it incredibly overpowered, but to me, actually kind of boring. And then Brewmaster Monk I've put down here in the Hell category. You know, I'm maining Paladin this season, and having played some Brewmaster Monk in Mythic Plus just to like get some gear on it and get some reps in, What an awful experience. You know, it has no damage, its tankiness is terrible, the self-healing is poor, the group utility is poor. The only thing it really brings to the table is like Leg Sweep and Ring of Peace, and that's stuff you can get from a much better spec of Monk by playing either of the other specs of Monk. So there's really nothing that Brewmaster Monk does that is of value at all. And in high level pushing, you could say that Blood DK and Brewmaster Monk are basically the same in terms of like being a tank that isn't tanky. But Blood DK at least brings grips, it brings some utility there, and it brings a lot of damage. Monk doesn't even do that. And then also the rotation just is not fun at all to me in the current state of the game. You know, there's a lot of things that could be done to fix Brewmaster Monk, and Blizzard hasn't done any of them because they never do anything with Brewmaster Monk. They kind of just forget that that spec exists. And, you know, honestly, I think my recommendation would be that you should do the same. And so now I just kind of want to talk a little bit about the problems that we still feel are going on in Season 2 of the War Within's Mythic Plus. I think these are a lot less of an issue than they were in Season 1, but they're still there. So the number one issue is that there's just a huge disparity in damage from dungeon to dungeon, especially at high levels. You look at like the first room of Center Room Eatery or the first room of the Rookery, the first like large interior area, the dog room in Mechagon, or like any of the lieutenants in Priory, and they just do more damage than any single pull in all of Darkflame Cleft or the Motherlode or Top. There's also tank damage tuning that really is just all over the place. I would say the vast majority of tank mechanics aren't tank mechanics, they're DPS mechanics. They're a circle on the ground that hits the tank, and if it hits the tank, it does 15% of the tank's health, but if it hits a DPS, if a DPS gets clipped by the Platinum Pummel from the first boss of Mechagon, or the tank line from the caster boss in Theater of Pain, they die instantly. But if you're online and pressing your buttons at all as a tank, you never die to any of these tank mechanics. Basically, I would say that both of these issues are problems with tuning, and that's really the biggest failure of this season of Mythic Plus so far. Tuning is just wildly all over the place. They really haven't done a great job of tuning. To put it politely, I would say it is incomplete, but the design is a lot better. But it's still not perfect either. Another issue, I think, is that there are lots of dispel mechanics throughout these dungeons. There's a scourge of dispel mechanics. It's too much. There are also lots of interrupts, and we definitely chose correctly this season by running Paladin and Shaman. That's always been our favorite combo for late night pug keys, and we're absolutely carrying our groups on interrupts, so good call there. But for the alt keys in which we're playing DK and Priest, or God forbid Monk and Priest, it's awful. It's really bad to not have a Paladin or a Demon Hunter as your tank, because they're just absolutely capable of covering up interrupts, and that is still a problem. I think it's just as much a tank class design problem as it is a dungeon design problem. There's really no reason why Monk can't have an AoE silence attached to Explosive Keg, for example. It wouldn't even make them good, but at the very least, every tank needs some way to control multiple casters at once if Blizzard is never going to solve the problem of having every pull be full of casters, and they never will. And then I think the final issue is just simply that the dungeon links are all kind of on the longer side. They're definitely not short. There's no super short dungeon this season. The Rookery would be the closest. In general, I would really prefer to see the hard time for Mythic Plus dungeons be around 15 minutes, maybe 20 at the longest. 3 dungeons per hour seems like a very reasonable amount. That's really what I think we both feel the aim of dungeons should be. That's perfect. But these dungeons are all over 30 minutes for the one chest timer, and realistically, they take about 25 minutes to complete with a decently successful group that's moving pretty quickly. Ignoring the time spent forming the group, a lot of the time you spend in the dungeons is just kind of spent hitting enemies that don't really do a lot. They auto-attack the tank pretty hard, or they alternate between spam casting Fireball and then occasionally using Pyroblast so you have something to priority interrupt. The health values on monsters are still just too high. You feel like you're hitting a training dummy a lot of the times. I think a lot of this comes from Tyrannical and Fortified still being in the game and being in every dungeon if you're doing 10s, and we're well past the point at which they should have just been retired, and that difficulty kind of redistributed into monster mechanics or into just the baseline monsters themselves. But Fortified and Tyrannical, they're boring. They're filler. They're unseasoned plain white rice. With that being said, we're definitely having more fun in this season and in these dungeons than we have in years. Now, as for me, do I owe it all to Paladin? not 100%. A lot of it though, but not quite 100%. Season 2 is great. It's definitely our favorite Mythic Plus season in quite a while. Obviously the best of the expansion so far, although that's not a high bar. But we're definitely having a good time. It's not a perfect season, but it is really good, a solid foundation to build on for future seasons in the War Within and even future expansions, and also a lot of fun to play right now. Alright, that's it. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and you want to see more like it, and if you want to support us even further, consider becoming a channel member. Thanks for watching. Bye.